Culture Counts by Serena, Nanda, and Richard L. Worms. Chapter 5. Making a Living. Arctic Cultures and Climate Change. Gwich'in elders long ago predicted that a day would come when the world would warm and things would not be the same with animals. That time is now, says Matthew Gilbert of the Gwich'in, an Athabascan people of the northeastern Alaska and northwest Canada. The lakes, the rivers, the waterfowl, and most of all, the caribou that we depend on are under threat. The subsistence strategies of Arctic populations, such as the Gwich'in, are well adapted in their harsh environment. Their knowledge and ingenious technology enabled them to be successful hunters. For thousands of years, the Gwich'in, the Inuit, and the other peoples of the Arctic hunted large land and sea animals, including caribou, polar bear, seal, walrus, and whales. They devised technologies that effectively utilized the materials of their environment for survival, building shelters of snow, which hold up the heat and keep out the wind, and expertly fashioning layered clothing that keeps out the cold yet prevents overheating. Their cultural and social organization are also adapted to their environment and foraging strategy. Their values emphasize cooperation and mutual aid. Their religious rituals provide effective outlets for the isolation and tension of long, dark winters, and their flexible kinship organization allows local populations to expand and contract in response to the seasonal variation in resources. The Inuit of Baffin Island, this involves a set of economic practices called the Ning-Ik-Tuk, best translated as sharing. The Ning-Ik-Tuk orders the flow of goods and food across individuals, families, and entire communities. Among the Inuit, no one need go without food or shelter. Inuit subsistence isn't just about food, it is also about practices that provide individuals with security. As with many other foragers, however, the Arctic peoples and their subsistence strategies have been significantly changed by the 20th century contact and the global economy. Most now base their livelihoods on a combination of cash income and foraging. Commercial trapping and fur sales became dependable resources of income, providing cash which they use to buy guns and ammunition, food, tobacco, tea, canvas tents, and clothing. Other sources of income today are handicrafts, tourism, work for oil corporations, and various kinds of government subsidies, and for the Alaska Natives, payments from the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Subsistence hunting and use of wild foods still provide at least half of the diet for the Arctic peoples. In current-day foraging techniques, make use of modern technologies such as snowmobiles, gasoline, fishing nets, and sleeping bags. Many Arctic households also enjoy modern conveniences, and this requires that household members work full-time or seasonally in the cash economy. However, Arctic lifestyles are threatened by global warming. Gideon James, a Gwich'in elder, notes that 30 years ago the permafrost was so solid that the land was flat. Now there is dents everywhere. These dents make travel and hunting far more difficult. Sea ice is critical to the adaptations of animals such as polar bears, seals, and walrus, and to the Arctic populations that depend on hunting them, but it is disappearing. Although there are year-to-year variations, satellite data show an Arctic sea ice decline of more than 13% per decade. The 2015 ice minimum, the measurement in September before the waters began to freeze again, was almost 30% less than the 1981-2000 average. As the climate warms and the ice melts, hunting becomes more difficult, and cultural patterns it sustains more fragile. In addition to climatic changes, Arctic peoples also face challenges to their subsistence for drilling for oil in the Arctic. Some, but not all of them, have become locally active in resisting the exploitation of oil reserves in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and other areas where oil companies now have access to offshore energy sources revealed by global warming. It is not clear how Arctic peoples will cope with the challenges that confront them. On the one hand, people regret the changes in hunting patterns that will inevitably happen as the earth warms. One Canadian Inuit said, "The next generation is not going to experience what we did. We can't pass the traditions on as our ancestors passed on to us." On the other hand, Arctic peoples have faced climate changes before, and it is worth remembering that they collectively have thousands of years of experience adapting to an extremely difficult environment. Arctic peoples have shown great flexibility in the past. Although global warming will lead to the disappearance of some species, it will also likely lead to an abundance of others, and Arctic hunters will likely adapt. Unlike most other animals, humans live in an extremely broad range of environments. Some, such as the Arctic or the Great Australian Desert, present extreme challenges to human existence and are relatively limited in the numbers of people they can support. Others, such as temperate forest or plains, can support large populations. The productivity of any particular environment, however, is related to the type of technology used to exploit it. For example, the Arctic can sustain only a relatively small population with the traditional Inuit technology. With modern technology and transportation, however, the circumpolar Arctic currently supports more than 4 million people, engaged in indigenous hunting and herding strategies as well as modern industrial pursuits. All societies must utilize the physical environment to provide their people with the basic material requirements for life: food, clothing, and shelter. Different societies have different subsistence strategies or ways of transforming the material resources of the environment into food. These various subsistence strategies are in turn related to differences in economic systems and forms of social organization. However, as environments change, so must subsistence strategies and hence other aspects of culture as well. Human adaptation, the environment, the technology. For most of the history of our species, humans and our ancestors lived by foraging, fishing, hunting, and collecting vegetable foods. As populations increased, foragers spread out to many environments, creating new tools and developing diverse cultures. By 16,000 to 12,500 years ago, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. However, foraging sets significant limits on population growth and density, and consequently on the complexity of social organization. About 11,000 to 10,000 years ago, human groups in the Old World began to domesticate plants and animals, a change that occurred about 1,000 years later in the New World. Called the Agricultural Revolution or sometimes the Neolithic Revolution, the transition to food production was really a gradual process that happened over centuries. Although it was revolutionary in the possibilities it opened up for the development of complex social organization. The domestication of plants and animals supported increasing populations as sedentary village life became widespread. Over time, means of applying more technology to farming and animal management were developed. This led not only to increased productivity, but also to greater control of human labor and eventually to complex social forms such as the state. In general, humans have historically used technology to produce greater quantities of food. At the same time, societies have tended to increase both in size and complexity. However, this did not happen everywhere and happened in different ways in different places. The question of why cultivation did not arise everywhere, and why some populations, such as the Aborigine peoples of Australia or the Inuit, never made the transition from foraging to food production, has several answers. First, many environments make cultivation difficult or impossible. The climate in the Arctic or in some deserts may preclude agriculture. Alternatively, some climates, such as the fertile valleys of California, are so productive that there is little pressure for people to make the transition to food production. Second, foraging is often far less work than cultivation. Farming requires field preparation, weeding and tending, harvesting, and storage of the harvest. Foraging does not. Farming requires long-term commitment to living in a single place, and this may not be possible in all places at all times. Lack of year-round water or political conditions such as raiding and warfare may make permanent residence impossible. Third, sometimes foraging strategies actually are more dependable than cultivation or animal husbandry. For example, the introduction of the horse by the Spaniards in the 16th century, some Native American plains cultures, such as the Cheyenne, did so well with bison hunting that they gave up farming and returned to foraging. Even today, many foraging and pastoral populations resist abandoning these occupations for cultivation. The Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was another dramatic change in the human subsistence strategies. The Industrial Revolution involved the replacement of human and animal energy by machines. It was truly revolutionary, both in the speed with which it developed and its effects on society. Industrialism greatly increased human productivity. In a typical non-industrial society, more than 80% of the population is directly involved in food production. In industrial societies, this number declines dramatically. In addition, industrialization has produced relatively high standard of living for enormous numbers of people. However, the price of industrialization has been high. Industrial societies have high levels of inequality, and the industry itself is a major source of environmental degradation and climate change. The energy and production needs of business and consumer desires of the world's people have had a devastating effect on the environment. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency holds over 180 hazardous air pollutants alone. Oil and gas exploration, logging, mining, dams, and other large-scale projects fundamentally change the environment. Although consumers in wealthy nations are responsible for most of the world's pollution, populations in China, India, and many other nations contribute increasing amounts and will contribute even more in the future. In mid-January 2013, the air quality index for Beijing climbed to 755. Any reading over 400 is considered hazardous. In December of 2015, the Chinese government issued a red alert, closing schools and limiting outdoor construction for several days as a result of high air pollution levels. The environmental problems resulting from industrial and post-industrial society have reawakened interest in respect for the subsistence adaptations of non-industrial people. Through detailed knowledge of their environment and using ingenious if simple technology, many non-industrial societies live in ways that are sustainable and create fewer environmental problems than industrialization. However, it is important to recall that current world population levels cannot be maintained by non-industrial subsistence techniques. We have much to learn from understanding non-industrial subsistence patterns, but we cannot simply copy them. Major types of subsistence strategies. Anthropologists identify 5 basic types of subsistence strategies: foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture, and industrialism. Foraging depends on the use of plant and animal resources for naturally available in the environment. Pastoralism primarily involves the care of domesticated herd animals, whose dairy and meat products are a major part of the pastoralist diet. Horticulture is the production of plants using a simple non-mechanized technology. Agriculture is food production that involves more complex technology that may include draft animals, the plow, and sophisticated techniques of water management, soil fertility, and erosion control. In agriculture, much of the land is under permanent cultivation. Finally, industrialism involves the use of machine technology and chemical processes for the production of food and other goods. Within these basic types of subsistence strategies, there is much diversity. Furthermore, many societies combine strategies to meet their material needs. Today, no society, however, seemingly remote, remains unaffected by industrialism and the global economy. Each subsistence strategy generally supports a characteristic level of population density, number of people per unit of land, productivity, yield per person per unit of land, and efficiency, yield per person per hour of labor invested. These criteria, in turn, tend to be associated with characteristic forms of social organization and certain cultural patterns. For example, in most environments, societies that use foraging subsistence strategy have relatively low productivity and efficiency compared to other subsistence strategies. As a result, they cannot support large populations. To limit population growth, they are likely to use cultural practices such as sexual abstinence, abortion, infanticide, late weaning, and prohibitions on sexual intercourse after the birth of a child. In the sections that follow, we will describe and provide example of each of the 5 subsistence strategies, focusing on the relationships between technologies and the structures of society and the cultural practices. Foraging. Foraging is a diverse strategy that includes hunting large and small game, fishing, and collecting various plant foods. Foragers do not produce food, either directly by planting or indirectly by keeping domestic animals. In most cases, foragers use simple tools including digging sticks, spatulas, spears, and bows and arrows. However, in some places such as the Arctic, foraging technology can be quite complex. Because foragers do not consciously alter their surroundings to produce food, in most cases, they have less impact on the environment than people following other subsistence strategies. Foragers use a variety of strategies. In some extreme environments, like that of the Arctic peoples described in the chapter opening, they may depend almost entirely on hunting. However, in most cases, they rely primarily on gathered vegetable foods. In most, but not all, foraging societies, women are responsible for gathering and men for hunting. Successful foraging requires extensive and highly detailed knowledge of the environment. Studies among the Juhuansi foragers of Botswana and Namibia show that women can identify over 150 species of edible plants, and men recognized over 40 species of edible animals. In most cases, foraging can support only a low population density. Foragers generally live in communities between 20 and 50 individuals. Even at this low density, few of the marginal areas where current-day foragers are found can support a year-round human population. Therefore, foraging almost always involves seasonal movement to gain access to water or food. Thus, foraging requires independence and mobility. For this reason, foraging bands tend to have highly flexible social arrangements, and values like ning, ki, tuk, see in the chapter opening, are common. Seasonal movement is also a strong distinctive for acclimation of material goods. Because they must frequently transport everything they own, their material possessions tend to be limited to items essential to their survival. In some environments, foraging is unquestionably harsh and a dangerous way of life. However, in less demanding places, foragers often live in relative abundance. Further, the extreme flexibility of foragers' social arrangements mean that there is very little hierarchy in foraging societies. At one time, all human beings lived by foraging, and foragers occupied fertile plains and river valleys. However, as forms of production developed, the number of foragers declined. Today they constitute only a very small portion of the world's population and are mostly found in marginal areas such as desert and Arctic tundra, into which they have been pushed by the expansion of militarily superior agricultural people and states. the Pintupi, a foraging society in Australia. The Pintupi people of the Gibson Desert of Australia were more typical of foraging than the Inuit described in the opening of this chapter. The key to their adaptation was the use of a wide variety of seasonally available plant and animal foods and their detailed knowledge of their environment. Even with simple technology, this made foraging a reliable strategy, though a very difficult way of life in certain seasons. The Pintupi recognize and can name 126 plants serving 138 different social, economic, and medicinal functions. They use more than 75 different plants for edible seeds. Their diet also includes tubers, fruits, nectars, sap, and edible insects, as well as birds' eggs, lizards, and small mammals. The main constraint on them is the scarcity of water during the driest and hottest months, which influences the distance they travel, the places they stay, and how much time they spend in each place. Thus, the Western Desert societies consist of small isolated family groups and population densities as low as 1 person per 150 to 200 square miles. Climatic changes are extreme. Summer temperatures reach 120 degrees, and winter temperatures average about 72 degrees. Rainfall is very low, unpredictable, and evaporates quickly. In the wet season, December through February, water is available, but food is scarce, limited mainly to that left over from the previous year's growing season. Men and women gather lizards and edible toads, which are relatively easy to collect. Families spread across the desert, moving great distances in search for food and to attend ceremonies. At the end of the wet season, when temperatures moderate, families move near the large surface water holes. June and July bring the greatest material prosperity, as tubers, fruits, and grass seeds are all abundantly available. Edible fruits are collected from 12 different plants and stored for the hungry time in November, when temperatures will rise to reach 120 degrees. People live around the water holes until August, when food availability decreases and temperatures rise. As the landscape dries out, people fall back into large holes where there's water. They set fires on plains to attract game and to stimulate the growth of new grass seeds and tubers for the following year. Both men and women spread most of the day in food quest, hunting monitor lizards and kangaroos and gathering fruits, bulbs, tubers, and grass seeds, which are both eaten and stored. November is the harshest time of the year. The intense heat and families travel to the largest rock holes for water, but even these occasionally run dry. Food becomes less available and many seeds and tubers run out completely. If the rain has not come by December, foraging ceases almost entirely. People try to take it easy to conserve food and water. Women remain in camp, looking after the children and the elderly, while men search for food, sometimes traveling as far from camp as 12 miles a day. Average daily intake may be reduced to 800 calories per person. Heat stress and the shortage of water prevent the whole camp from moving to areas where food might be more available, and people are thus trapped in areas around larger water holes. Under these conditions, weak individuals may be fed blood from healthier people to get them through the worst times. The Pintupi and other Australian foragers demonstrate the extraordinary ability of human beings to adapt to the most extreme environments. Though constrained by their simple technology, foragers' detailed knowledge of their environment has permitted them to survive for thousands of years, as well as to develop highly complex ceremonial, religious, kinship, and artistic cultural patterns. Tribes such as the Pintupi survived using foraging strategies until the mid-20th century. In the beginning of the 1920s, because of prolonged drought, the Pintupi began moving to mission stations, cattle stations, government settlements, and towns around the desert fringe. The last Pintupi left the western desert in 1984. Though they often visit the desert and continue to do some foraging, they no longer depend on it for all their needs. For their point of view, food was easier to get elsewhere. The Pintupi subsistence strategy demonstrates that foraging in extreme environments can be harsh existence with periods of desperation. However, in less extreme environments where predictable vegetable foods can be supplemented by hunting, foragers may experience abundant leisure time and generally good health. For example, Richard Lee estimated that the adult of a Dobe Juhasi of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa spends an average of only 2.5 6-hour days per week in subsistence strategies, and women can gather enough in one day to feed her family for 3 days. Today, like the Pintupi, most foragers have moved to permanent settlements, either by choice or as the result of government pressure. Old trading relationships between foragers and non-foraging people have, in most places, disappeared or become greatly diminished. Although people throughout the world continue to forage when they can, members of contemporary foraging bands rely on the markets for much of their food. Pastoralism. Pastoralists depend primarily on the products of domesticated herd animals. They are found mostly in environments that, because of hilly terrain, dry climate, or unsuitable soil, cannot support a large human population through agriculture. However, these places can support herd animals if they are allowed to range over a large area. Because human beings cannot digest grass, raising animals that can live on grasses makes pastoralism an efficient way to exploit grasslands. Unlike ranching, commercial animal husbandry, in which livestock are fed grain that could be used to feed humans, pastoralism does not require that animals and humans compete for the same resources. Pastoralists may herd cattle, sheep, goats, yaks, or camels, all of which produce meat, milk, and blood. The major areas of pastoralism are found in East Africa, North Africa, Southwestern Asia, Central Asia, and the subarctic. Before the arrival of Europeans, and with the exception of llama and alpaca, North and South America did not have animals that could be herded, so pastoralism was much less common there. Pastoralism is either transhumant or nomadic. In transhumant pastoralism, mostly found in East Africa, men and boys move the animals regularly throughout the year to different areas of pastures become available at different altitudes or in different climatic zones, while women and children and some men remain at a permanent village site. In nomadic pastoralism, the whole population moves with the herds throughout the year, and there are no permanent villages. Pastoralism involves a complex interaction among animals, land, and people. With domestication, animals become dependent on their human keepers for pasture, water, breeding, shelter, salt, and protection from predators. Pastoralists must be highly knowledgeable about the needs of their animals, the carrying capacity of the land, and the subsistence demands of the human population. The key to the pastoralist economy is herd growth. The number of animals needed to support a family is a consistent concern for pastoralists. Eating or selling too many animals in a single year may lead to insolvency, so pastoralists must always balance their present needs against the future herd production. However, animals are also a source of wealth and prestige among pastoralists, so they may keep herd sizes well above any immediate need. Pastoralism is a risky business. Weather disasters such as drought or storms, disease, or theft can easily disseminate a herd. Although there are some groups, such as indigenous peoples of Chukota, who eat diets most entirely composed of meat and fish, most pastoralists also need access to grains and other agricultural products. They require these by trading animal products with other people and sometimes spend a part of the year working in other occupations. The Yahara Madzai described below are a good example of this. The Yahara Madzai, a nomadic pastoralist society in Iran. The Yahara Madzai, who live in the southeastern corner of Iran, known as the Baluchistan, are an example of a mixed pastoralist adaptation that has undergone changes due to both global economy and the restraints of adapting to the control of the national state. Yahara Madzai territory occupies a plateau at 5,000 feet above sea level, where adequate water and pasture is available only part of the year. They solved this problem by moving to seek pasture according to the seasons. The Yahara Madzai live in small camps between 5 to 20 families. When they receive information about the location of good pasture, the whole Yahara Madzai camp migrates. Because even good pasturage can be quickly exhausted, the camp migrates constantly, anywhere from 5 to 25 miles each move. Most of the maximum 6-inch annual rainfall occurs in winter. This means that there is good pasturage on the Yahara Madzai's high plateau in the spring. However, by June or July, the animals have eaten all of the spring growth and the weather has turned to very dry and hot. In response, the Yahara Madzai migrate to areas reserved by government irrigation projects to earn money by harvesting grain. They remain there until the harvest ends in early autumn. Then they migrate back to the lowland desert where the groves of date palms leaving their tents, as well as their goats and sheep on the plateau in the care of young boys. They harvest dates and prepare date pastures for the return journey to their winter camps. At this time, the Yahara Madzai plateau is almost completely barren, with very little for the animals to eat. The animals must live on their acclimated fat and with small quantities of roots, grains, dates, and processed date pits their keepers provide. The people depend on food stores from the previous year, but because winter is the rainy season, water is normally available. Milk is the staple food of the Yahara Madzai and is consumed in many different forms and preserved as dried milk, solids, and butter. Milk and milk products are also sold in exchange for grain. Milk is the main source of protein, fat, calcium, and other nutrients. The Yahara Madzai, like most pastoral peoples, do not eat much meat. Their herds are their capital, and the Yahara Madzai hope to increase their size. Because killing animal for food works against this objective, the Yahara Madzai rarely do it. As we've seen, although the Yahara Madzai continue to herd animals, their activities engage them in larger economic spheres. Many pastoralists have adapted their production to often challenging and unstable demands of local and even global markets. Nomads in Afghanistan and Iran, for example, are highly integrated into national and international trade networks. They specialized in selling meat animals to local markets, lambskin to international buyers, and sheep intestines to meet the large German demand for natural sausage casings. In eastern Tibet, pastoral persists, but pastoralists depend on harvesting caterpillar fungus, which is highly valued in China, Japan, and Southeast Asia for its medicinal uses. Fungus trading now accounts for 50 to 80% of household incomes among the eastern Tibet's pastoralists. Pastoralism cannot support an indefinitely increasing population. Further, since it's difficult to provide services to mobile populations or to control them, nations often design policies to encourage or force pastoralists to become sedentary. However, because products of pastoralism are high in demand and because pastoralism is a powerful strategy for survival on lands where agriculture is difficult, pastoralism in some form has a strong future. Horticulture. Horticultural societies depend primarily on the production of plants using simple non-mechanized technology such as hoes or digging sticks, but not draft animals, irrigation techniques, or plows. Gardens are used for a number of years, then allowed to recover their fertility over a long fallow period, sometimes lasting decades. Horticulturalists usually grow enough food in their fields or gardens to support a local group, but they do not produce surpluses that involve the group in a wider market system. Population densities among horticultural peoples are generally low, usually not exceeding 150 people per square mile. Despite this, horticultural villages may be quite large, ranging from 100 to 1,000 people. Horticulture may be practiced in dry lands, such as northeastern Arizona, where the Hopi Indians cultivate maize, beans, and squash, but it is typically in a tropical forest adaptation. In these environments, people practice swidden, slash and burn cultivation, clearing fields by felling trees and burning the brush. The burned vegetation is allowed to remain on the soil, which prevents it from drying out. The resulting bed of ash also acts as a fertilizer, allowing nutrients into the soil. Fields are used for a few years, then allowed to lie fallow for a longer period, so that the forest cover can be rebuilt and soil fertility restored. Swidden cultivators require 5 to 6 times as much fallow land as they are actually cultivating. Swidden cultivation can have a debilitating effect on the environment if fields are cultivated before they have lain fallow long enough to recover their forest growth. Eventually, the forest will not grow back, and the grasslands will replace the tree cover. Because of this, governments often consider swidden cultivation both inefficient and destructive. However, modern industrial strategies such as logging and agribusiness, not swidden cultivation, are mainly responsible for the deterioration and disappearance of tropical forest. Recent studies report that soil fertility is better preserved using long fallow swidden agriculture than annual cropping or tree plantations, and that replacing swidden with intensified agriculture can lead to swift environmental deterioration. Horticulture is also a mixed subsistence strategy. Most swidden cultivators grow several crops. They may also hunt, fish, or raise some domestic animals. In New Guinea, for example, domestic pigs are an important source of protein, and the Yanomamo of the Amazon rainforest hunt monkeys and other forest animals. The Kofiar of Nigeria practice a wide range of strategies including swidden agriculture, keeping domesticated animals, and participating in the global economy. The Lua, a horticultural society in Southeast Asia. The Lua of northern Thailand are swidden cultivators. Swidden gardens are cultivated in regular rotational sequence. After using a block of land for 1 or 2 years, villagers allow it to lie fallow for about 9 years before planting again. In January, village elders inspect the gardens, and they expect the use of the following year to confirm that the forest regrowth is adequate for cultivating. Using long steel-bladed knives, the men clear their fields by felling small trees. They leave strips of trees along the watercourses and at the tops of the ridges to prevent erosion and to provide seed sources for the forest regrowth during the fallow period. They leave taller trees standing, but trim their branches so they will not shade the crops. Such Lua practices encourage ecosystem diversity. The fields cleared in January and February dry until the end of March, when a day is chosen to burn them. First, a fire break is cleared around the field so the fire does not accidentally spread into the forest. Then the swidden is burned. The cultivators plant cotton and corn on the slopes of the fields and yams on the lower, wetter portions. By mid-April, they begin to plant the main subsistence crop, upland rice, jabbing the earth loose with 10-foot iron-tipped planting poles. They hope the rice will take root and sprout before the heavy monsoon rains come. Different types of rice are sown in different areas of the field. Quick ripening rice is planted near the field shelter, where it can be easily watched. Drought-resistant varieties are planted on the drier and sandier tops of the slopes, along with millet. In addition, there are gardens with mustard greens, peppers, beans, and other vegetables. Vine plants are grown in places particularly susceptible to erosion. In May, weeding begins, mainly women and older children using short-handed tools to scrape and hack at the weeds on the surface. Weeds are not dug or pulled out by the roots. Both men and women harvest the rice using small handheld sickles, cutting the stems of each bunch of rice close to the ground. The stalks are spread to dry out for a few days, then the young men beat them against the threshing mat to knock the rice grains loose, separating them as completely as possible. After a second winnowing, the cleaned rice is loaded into baskets and kept in a temporary barn near the field shelter. After the harvest, swidens are allowed to lie fallow. However, Lua also keep pigs, water buffalo, cattle, and chickens, and these animals use the plants that grow on fallow gardens. The Lua also forage for medicinal plants and during times of food shortage. In earlier times, Lua hunted and fished, but environmental changes and increased population in the past 50 years has greatly reduced these activities. By the mid-20th century, many newcomers had begun to settle in Lua territory. They were less careful about their swidden practices than the Lua, and the quality of the land began to deteriorate. In addition, through these environmental regulations and the promotion of development projects, the government pressured the Lua to limit their use of swidens. The result has been an increase of intensive agriculture and cattle herding. Many crops, such as sorghum and cotton, have been severely reduced or eliminated. Cattle now graze the fallow swidens, leaving few plants for human use. The increase of cash cropping on soybeans has transformed the previously clear and free-flowing streams to muddy, polluted pools, which the Lua consider too dirty to wash their clothes in. A year-round irrigation has brought in year-round mosquitoes. The changes in swidden practices among the Lua are typical of trends in Southeast Asia, perhaps worldwide. Rising population, pressure toward industrial agriculture from governments and corporations, and the desire of farmers to raise and sell cash crops all work against swidden agriculture. A recent analysis shows that other agricultural systems are replacing swidden farming in Southeast Asia and that fallow times are growing shorter where it's still being practiced. The authors note, however, that farmers maintain short fallow swidden farming alongside other agricultural practices, so it is unlikely to disappear entirely. Despite this, the move away from swidden farming will have profound cultural consequences for the Lua and other groups. Using anthropology, anthropologists, and nutrition. Anthropologists have long been involved in trying to understand the foods that people eat and their effect on health and nutrition. Some nutritional anthropologists are concerned with trying to improve the nutritional status of people. Others are more concerned to discover what we can or cannot learn from the diets of various groups. The work of the husband and wife team, Nevin Crimshaw and Mary Goodrich, is an example of the first. Scrimshaw, one of the world's most important nutrition scientists, and was trained in biology, sociology, medicine, and public health. Goodrich, his wife, was trained in nutritional anthropology. As a doctor working in Central America after World War II, he was struck by the large number of young children who suffered from protein malnutrition. He designed a cheap protein source based on cottonseed meal that was both culturally acceptable and extremely inexpensive. He did the same with a peanut-based product in India in the 1960s. He also worked to find ways to add goiter-preventing iodine to the types of salt available in Central America. Scrimshaw traveled with his wife, who introduced anthropological data into his studies. They worked together in Guatemala, Indonesia, and other places. When he helped found the Institute of Nutrition of Central America and Panama, a direct aid and research organization that works to provide food security in several Central American countries, he sought advice from a well-known anthropologist, including Margaret Mead. As the Institute's first director, he brought in anthropologists including Richard Adams and Nancy Solon de Gonzalez to help the Institute's policies, particularly towards native Mayan populations. James Howe's work among the Kuna is an example of anthropologists learning from diets of different societies. The Kuna are a large ethnic group, mostly living in Panama. In the past decade, they have received a lot of attention because of claims of their high level of cocoa consumption was linked to lower rates of cardiovascular disease. Norman Holenberg, the lead researcher of many of the studies, claimed that the high consumption of locally grown chocolate by rural Kuna explained the fact that they had far lower levels of hypertension and heart disease than Kuna living in urban areas such as Panama City. According to Hollenberg, The rural Kuna consumed a minimum of 35 cups of chocolate drink a week, and that is associated with their good health. Unfortunately, for the chocolate lovers among us, Howe's work shows that Hollenberg's assertions about the Kuna chocolate consumption are simply incorrect. Although the Kuna do drink chocolate, they consume very much less than Hollenberg states, and much of that is commercially powdered chocolate. They do use cacao beans in religious ceremonies, but by burning them rather than drinking chocolate. Howe notes that the rural Kuna diet is low in fat and higher in fruit and fish than most of urban dwellers in general, and that is far more likely to explain their better health than is chocolate consumption. He argues that Hollenberg makes the mistake of basing health claims for chocolate on the Kuna because he neither spent sufficient time with the Kuna nor devoted effort to examining the rich anthropological literature about them. Agriculture. In agriculture, the same piece of land is repeatedly cultivated with plows, draft animals, and more complex technique of water and soil control than horticulturists used. Plows are more efficient at loosening the soil than are digging sticks or hoes. Turning the soil brings nutrients to the surface. Irrigation is often important in agriculture and may require elaborate terracing in hilly areas and sophisticated systems of water control. Pre-industrial agriculture uses techniques of natural fertilization, selective breeding of livestock and crops, and crop rotation, all of which increase productivity. Intensive cultivation generally supports higher population densities than horticulture. In Indonesia, for example, the island of Java, with 9% of the nation's land area, is able to support more than 2/3 of the Indonesian population through intensive right cultivation using elaborate irrigation terraces. The Javanese population density of well over 2,000 people per square mile contrasts sharply with the maximum population density of swidden areas in Indonesia, which is about 145 people per square mile. The greater productivity of agriculture also results in more intensive use of labor. Farmers must work long and hard to make the land productive. For example, growing rice in an irrigated paddy requires about 233 person days of labor per each year of hectare. In addition to human labor, agriculture requires more capital investment than horticulture. Plows must be bought and draft animals raised and cared for. Although agriculturists may have more control over food production than horticulturists, they are more vulnerable to the environment. When people depend on the intensive cultivation of one or two crops, one crop failure or disease that strikes draft animals may become an economic disaster. Agriculture is generally associated with sedentary villages. The rise of cities and states, occupational diversity and social stratification, and other complex forms of social organization. In contrast to horticulturalists who grow food primarily for the subsistence of their households, most agriculturists are peasants. They produce for their own family, but are also integrated into large complex state societies. Part of their food production is taken from them through markets, rents, and taxes. This supports non-food producing occupational specialists such as religious and political elites, trade and craft people, and a variety of other professionals. Musha, a peasant agricultural village in Egypt. Musha is an agricultural village about 250 miles south of Cairo in the Nile Valley. Musha farmers practice a 2-year crop rotation system based on both summer and winter crops. The cycle begins with cotton in the first summer, followed by wheat in the first winter. Maize or sorghum follows in the second summer, or the land may be left fallow. The cycle is completed in the second winter with millet, lentils, and chickpeas. In addition, farmers grow grapes and pomegranates and a variety of vegetables for home consumption. They also depend on milk, cheese, and butter from water buffalo, cows, sheep, and goats. A portion of the production must be used to pay taxes, or for rent if farmers do not own all the land they plant. Far more must be used to require other things in the household needs. The household is central to Musha cultivation, with extra laborers hired as needed. Women do not work in the fields, but keep the house, care for the animals, and make cheese. Children, who often work both for their own families and are hired by others, cut clover for the animals and help harvest cotton. The head of the household plays a key managerial role, supervising others, making agricultural purchases, hiring labor, and managing the household budget. Historically, Musha farmers relied on either animal power or human effort and a few basic wooden tools. Shallow plows and threshing sleds were pulled by oxen. Winnowing relied on the wind and a winnowing fork and sieves for the final cleaning. Donkeys and camels were also used to haul crops, people, and equipment. Starting in the 1950s, Musha farmers began to move to mechanized agriculture. By 1980, almost all farmers used machines at least some of the time. They also came to depend on chemical fertilizers and pesticides as well as animal manure. In the 1960s, when the completion of the Aswan High Dam was brought to an end to the flooding of the Nile, the government constructed fed canals, and these became the main source of water for the fields. The government maintains the canals, and the farmer must raise water from them to the level of the fields. Gasoline-powered pumps that perform this task are generally owned by several people who share the work involved in their maintenance and operation. After arranging for the distribution of the water to his fields, the farmer must hire a driver and tractor to plow the fields if he, like many small farmers, does not own one. Fertilizer and seed are hauled from the village bank to his home and from his home to the field. The fertilizer is then spread by hand. Wheat is one of the most important crops in Musha. It is planted in November and harvested in May and June. Hired laborers usually harvest wheat using a small sickle. The reaped wheat is bundled into sheaves, which are transported by camel or wagon to the threshing ground, where it is fed to a threshing machine. The threshed grain is winnowed and sifted by specialists who are paid a price rates. Finally, the grain and straw are hauled from the threshing ground back to the farmer's storeroom. In deciding on their strategies for making a living, Musha farmers must adapt to government policies. At one time, the government controlled prices for key crops such as wheat and cotton. However, direct government intervention was greatly reduced or eliminated in the 1980s and 1990s. Despite this, the government is still heavily involved in agriculture. Government organizations make loans to farmers, distribute agricultural inputs such as seed and fertilizer, subsidize the production of particular agricultural products, and buy some of the farmers' crops. State policies such as importing wheat from the United States affect the prices that farmers receive. The state sets land ownership laws, which makes rules governing land tenancy and affects labor market through policies that encourage migration. Profits from farming are uncertain, and most families have several sources of income. Sales of animals, fruits and vegetables, and handicrafts supplement household income. In fact, 70% of village households derive their major income from activities other than farming. Day labor, government jobs, craft trades, specialist agricultural work, as well as remittances from family members who have migrated, or rents and pensions. Farmers today must know the skills of farming as well as how to manage a wide range of other activities. They must interact with family members and government officials and negotiate with owners of tractors, day laborers, and many others. They supervise agricultural work and manage a wide range of activities, making important decisions at every step. Farmers are affected by global prices for the commodities they produce, as well as the policies of their own national government and foreign governments. All over the world, farmers are increasingly part of a globalized, industrialized economy. Industrialism. In industrialism, the focus of production moves away from food to the production of other goods and services. Investments in machinery and technologies of communication and information become increasingly important. In foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, and agriculture, most of the population is involved in producing food. Although the food industry is very large in industrial societies, only a very small percentage of the population is directly involved in food production. In the United States, in the early 1900s, more than one-third of families lived on farms. In 2012, there were 2.1 million farms in the United States, but only 1 million people, less than 1% of the population, listing farming as their primary occupation. Further, 75% of U.S. farms had sales of $50,000 or less. This means that more than 80% of the total U.S. agriculture comes from the remaining 25% of U.S. farms. Industrialism has an explosive effect on many aspects of economy, society, and culture. It has led to vastly increased population growth, expanded consumption of resources, especially energy, increased occupational specialization, and a shift from working for subsistence and selling the products of one's labor to selling the labor itself for hourly or yearly wages. In every industrialized society, most people work for wages that they use to purchase foods, goods, and services. Although cash transactions are found in other production systems, almost all transactions in industrial economies involve money. Industrial economies are based on the principles that consumption must consistently expand and material standards of living must always rise. This contrasts with economies based by the production systems previously discussed, which put various limits on both production and consumption, thus make lighter demands on their environments. Industrialism today has vastly outgrown national boundaries. The result has been great movement of resources, capital, and labor as the whole world has gradually been drawn to the global economy, a process called globalization. Contemporary industrial and post-industrial societies are characterized by well-coordinated specialized labor forces that produce goods and services, and by much smaller elite and managerial classes that oversee day-to-day operations of the workplace and control what is produced and how it is distributed. Increasingly, mobility, specific skills, and education are required for success. Because industrialized societies generate much higher levels of inequality than societies based on foraging, pastoralism, or horticulture, and because industrial systems require continued expansion, wealth, and poverty become critical social issues. Unequal distributions of opportunity, economic failure, illness, and misfortune limit the life chances of vast numbers of people in industrialized societies. Conversely, economic success creates lifestyles well above poverty for large numbers and conditions of truly extraordinary wealth for a very small number. Inequalities characterize relations among as well within nations. The creation of complex global systems of exchange between those who supply raw materials and those who use them in manufacturing, as well as between manufacturers and consumers, has resulted in increasingly disparities of wealth around the world. The beef industry. Industrialized agriculture in the United States. The American beef industry is a good if disturbing example of industrialism. Americans have had a long love affair with beef. Because meat was expensive for the average family during much of America's past, in the 20th century, beef became both the symbol and the substance for having made it into the middle class. For Americans, steak is symbolic of manliness, and the meat and potatoes make up the iconic American meal. As the standard of living in the United States rose after World War II, so did the demand for inexpensive beef. The post-war era brought the rise of suburbs and the entry of large numbers of women into the workforce. This increased the complexity of American family life and reduced the amount of time available for cooking and dining together. thus favoring packaged, convenience foods, and meat could be rapidly prepared. In addition, beginning in the 1960s, the expansion of the fast food industries greatly increased the American consumption of hamburgers and the demand for beef. In 2007, McDonald's purchased close to 1 billion pounds of beef in the United States alone. Until the mid-18th century, American dinner tables had been supplied with meat that came through a production chain that started on the family farm and ended in the neighborhood retail butcher shop. However, this system of production could not generate the levels of supply that families and fast food chains now demanded. Only large corporations employing mass production technologies could meet this high level of demand. By the late 1980s, most family farms were no longer economically viable, and many small farmers lost their land. Rural America became dominated by large farming operations tied to multinational corporations. The cost of labor is a significant factor in the production of meat. Through the 1970s and the 1980s, meat processors succeeded in driving down wages paid to workers. The key to this was their use of non-union workers, frequently immigrants from Latin America and Southeast Asia. In many cases, these workers were undocumented. For example, when immigration and customs agents raided agri-processors in Pottsville, Iowa, in 2008, more than a third of its workers were found to be undocumented. Such workers were not easily or very willingly absorbed into tightly knit farm communities and small towns. As the rural economy declined, resentment of immigrants and social problems increased. There were strains on healthcare, schools, social services. Binge drinking is far more common among rural than among urban children. The use of methamphetamine and Oxycontin among young adults in rural areas is about twice as high as the use of these drugs among their urban counterparts. In many cases, large-scale meatpacking had disastrous environmental impacts. U.S. livestock production creates about 900 million tons of waste annually. In Iowa, hog farming alone produces 50 million tons of manure annually. This waste often seeps into local streams and groundwater supplies, polluting critical resources. Although some rural regions experienced short-term job increases from the meatpacking industries, this pollution created a hidden cost and long-term downside for rural communities. The efficiency of assembly line beef processing has high human costs as well. The meatpacking industry has a long history of horrific working conditions. In 1906, Upton Sinclair described the deeply impoverished lives, terrible working conditions, and hopelessness of workers in Chicago slaughterhouses. Although the meatpacking industry today is vastly different from the industry in the early 20th century, working conditions at America's 6,278 meat and poultry slaughtering and processing plants are still deeply disturbing in many cases. The low cost and high availability of American meat is made possible by cheap labor and getting the maximum product out the door. On the floor, this translates into a large proportion of unskilled, poorly trained, low-paid hourly workers, a sped-up disassembly line, and few break periods for workers. Work in the meatpacking industry is difficult and dangerous even in the best plants. The processing operations involve thousands of moving animals to be stun-gunned by a knocker and axed in half by splitters on moving platforms, and deboned and cut up with sharp knives molded by an assortment of specialists such as stickers, gutters, tail rippers, and head droppers. The working conditions of this sector of American agribusiness are so severe that Human Rights Watch has deemed them in violation of international standards and basic human rights. These conditions affect not only the health of the workers, but also the quality of the product. This was dramatically demonstrated in early 2008 when the Westland Hallmark Meatpacking Company recalled 143 million pounds of contaminated meat, some of which was used in school lunch programs. It was the largest meat recall in U.S. history. Smaller recalls are frequent. For example, there were 150 meat recalls in 2015, together totaling more than 21.1 million pounds. Despite this, the demand for inexpensive beef remains high, and the meaningful reform of the industry does not seem likely in the near future. The global marketplace. The contemporary world is characterized by connectedness and change of magnitude greater than anything seen in earlier times. For some people, the expansion of the global economy has meant new and more satisfying means of making a living. However, these opportunities are not equally available to all peoples or to all individuals within a culture. For many people, the promise of prosperity offered by the global economy has yet to be fulfilled. Anthropology is particularly sensitive to the complex linkages among local, regional, national, and global contexts that structure the modern world. Anthropologists today can play an important role in shaping government and global economic policies that take into account the environmental impact of different ways of making a living, the values and practices of local cultures, international plant and animal conservation efforts, and corporate and state-driven efforts to participate in global markets. In the post-industrial globalized society, individuals, governments, and businesses must find new ways to adapt to significant changes in production and distribution of the goods. We explore some of these changes in Chapter 6 on economics.